often we read the doomsday merchants. And that's a very popular topic, to be told that all the jobs are going to disappear. We're told that digitalisation, automation is of enormous threat. And is it any wonder that many blue-collar people take these views very seriously? After all, they are told constantly that their way of life is going to be taken from them and that there's nothing being put in its place. Now, those views, I can go to some length to explain why that's nonsense, but it is repeated again and again and again. It has a profound consequence to the way in which our society is actually organised. Is it any wonder that people in these circumstances turn to alternatives to the mainstream political organisations? Now, we know that the great bulk of the jobs that are being created at the moment are in the inner cities. We know that they're being created amongst a group of people that are extremely well off already. That there has been this hollowing out of economic opportunities in the outer suburbs and the provincial cities of our country. That is the very place in which governments are actually formed. Now, this is a pattern that is not unique to Australia. This is a pattern that we're seeing in the political economy throughout the Western world. And is it any wonder, therefore, that people around the world are turning their backs on democracy and go to the extremes? Now, I say, well, it doesn't have to be like that. And that's why we say, of course, that there is this critical role to be played in terms of building prosperity, but not by adopting a hostile attitude to technology, but by adopting the attitude that this is the way in which we can repair the social fabric if we choose to. And that's why we say there is a critical role for us to be able to develop relationships between good policy in industry and good policies in terms of science and research. Now, there's a view around, well, of course, that particularly manufacturing is old hat and it's old-fashioned and we don't really need to pay much attention to it. That there's a natural tendency for this area of the economy to decline. That's not the view in all countries. It's a view of a political ideological group within certain aspects of the West, particularly in countries like this. It's not the view in Germany, for instance. Now, in Germany, we're taking other attitudes, and the critical role there is that we can, as a society, make choices. The Germans have a policy framework called Industry 4.0, where they talk about the role of business, the role of labour, and the role of science. Science is put on an equal footing with these other great social forces, if you like, to provide the technological advances so that we can deal with the questions of automation, deal with the questions of digitalisation, we can deal with more efficient uses of energy. We can, in fact, establish a social compact. Because it's important to remember, technology does not create sweatshops. People do. The social conditions in which we live are decisions made by people. That's a product of politics, of power. It's not a product of technology. And that's why I say it's so important to ensure that advanced manufacturing is an important part of our future policy development. Just as important as ensuring that we have adequate funding and support for science and research. The two go together. This is how we ensure that we're able to provide the sorts of jobs that we need for the future. And that's not by saying we're going to turn our backs on technology. The Germans talk about growing manufacturing employment by 6%, increasing unemployment by 6%. A fundamentally different approach than the approach that we take in this country or many other countries. They do it by embracing technology, but by saying there's got to be a social construct around the way in which it's used, and ensuring that the political system responds to the aspirations of its people. Now, we have an opportunity in this country to follow suit, if we choose it. If we choose it. I want to emphasise that. It's a matter of political choice. Now, what have we got in this country? Well, unfortunately, we had a last election, and I think Arthur Sinodinos made the point. The government tried to bring on the issue of innovation, did it very badly. Talked about innovation as about something that was essentially an inner city idea for a particularly limited number of people. It was about the startups culture. It wasn't about the general population. It was about the really inner city notion of how the economy was to be formed. And as Arthur says, the government got a shellacking. Now, the consequence of that, they don't want to mention it anymore. Not quite as bad as it was with Tony Abbott, where the word itself was banned, but it's sort of moved in that direction now. So the government's had, about 20-odd reviews in science, research and innovation since it came to office in 2013. Most of them haven't been responded to. It's almost as if the paralysis has now set in to the point where they're all on the great shelf, back shelf of the government. The big one I'm really concerned about is what's happening on the research R&D. The R&D review, 3F's review, has been with the government since April last year. Deeply concerned because this is the way in which we really want to talk about developing that relationship between the academy, between science and industry. It'll be through measures such as the premium rate through our R&D concessions. We have, of course, other reviews into research infrastructure, review into reporting requirements of research block grants, the preliminary issues paper for the strategic plan, and so many others. We're still waiting for a reply. Now, this is not the way in which to proceed, and so I'm concerned that we are lacking that strategic direction. The government has picked up some changes, the Watt review into some of the questions around this issue of impact and engagement. Now, those of you who know me for some time I've always said I was really concerned about trying to develop a very narrow view of commercialisation, a distorted view of commercialisation. The government's, unfortunately, in this environment, has gone back to its old ways of attempting to cater for some of the worst knuckle draggers that this country's produced, the Andrew Bolts of this world, so that we can't really get an assessment of the importance of basic research. We are no longer given the emphasis to excellence in research. And certainly, if I get the chance again, that will be restored. And it's important because without new knowledge, there is no commercialisation. If we don't get that relationship right, we do undermine the fundamentals of our innovation system. So the government's arrangements through the ARC and their recently announced changes to the impact and engagement measures, I think are fundamentally a waste of time and a waste of money. They produce yet again another report on how any smart people, and our universities are full of some of the smartest people in the country, will have no trouble at all in finding an eminently routable way to be able to produce the necessary metrics to demonstrate how well they're going without actually changing anything. And so I don't think that's the way to proceed. We have, of course, changes that we need to make in terms of their funding arrangements, and I think some of these reviews that talk about the importance of the CRC program. We could do some really basic things very quickly. For instance, restoration of public benefit research. We could make some changes in regard to these ridiculous time limits that have been imposed on some of the highest quality research programs that we've actually engaged in through proper collaborations that this country has actually ever seen. We also have this EAF fund, $3.7 billion, sitting there, earning nothing more than a cash rate at the moment. Squandered. Remember their first plan? They were going to use it for the privatisation of roads. And now, of course, it's part of their funding package, and we're waiting on them. Once again, they're claiming it's for disabilities. In fact, it's to pay down debt. There, to me, is a great sum of money which could be used, and this for the funding of our research infrastructure. This is an area where the Clark, one of those reviews I mentioned, the Clark review picks up, and it's chapter 6 of that review, something I really urge you to have another look at. I certainly will, because it's a way in which we could actually take considerable steps forward. Now, I know in the business community there is an understanding of how important it is to get basic research infrastructure right. And that's one way in which it can be done. There are also questions that have been raised in regard to the block grants arrangements. And I think for far too long we've had them on this drip feed arrangements. We need to make sure that there's a more permanent arrangement put in place so that they move off the temporary into the permanent arrangement, a position I know that many of you have argued for a great deal of time. Another position I'd be only too happy to pursue given the opportunity. Let me just finish on this note. I think the big problem, the paralysis within the government, comes down to a pretty simple problem. Mr Turnbull came to office with very, very high expectations. It's probably meant, as a consequence, that the crumbling of his authority has seemed even more immense. The government now moves from crisis to crisis. We're not actually able to do very much. This latest citizenship fiasco, just an example, but there are many, many others. We're waiting, in effect, and I think the public is just losing so much confidence in the political system, and I think can only really be resolved by a general election. That's where we're going. And I think whenever that occurs, I look with some confidence to our capacity to engage and rise to the challenge and do something about what is a fundamental crisis of confidence in our political system at the moment. Thank you very much.